Old woman saved 4 wolf cubs. Years later, you won't believe how they returned the favor. When an elderly woman stumbled upon 4 helpless wolf cubs, she didn't hesitate to save them, raising them with care and kindness. Years later, when she needed help the most, the wild creatures she once nurtured returned in the most astonishing way. What they did to repay her will leave you speechless. Many years ago, in a small village in Russia, an extraordinary story unfolded. Doris had spent her entire life there, born and raised by her loving parents. As she grew older, she built a life of her own, eventually starting a family with her husband, Carl. Doris and Carl shared a deep love and soon decided to start a family of their own. Before long, Doris gave birth to a beautiful baby girl whom they named Alexis. For many years, their home was filled with happiness as they created cherished memories together. As time passed and Alexis grew older, she eventually met a man she fell in love with, beginning a new chapter in her life. Alexis and her husband married, but due to his important job in the finance industry, they had to move closer to the city, leaving Doris and Carl behind. Though they missed their daughter, Doris and Carl were happy for her and assured her they would not worry about them. However, a few years later, tragedy struck. Carl fell seriously ill and sadly passed away. After 40 years of marriage, Doris was left on her own. At first, Sophia insisted that Doris should move in with her and her husband so that they could look after the elderly woman and so that she wouldn't be on her own. But Doris refused, as she didn't want to leave the village that had been her home for her entire life. Luckily, even though she was now on her own, there were still people in the village willing to help her out, as she had been a well-loved teacher at the local school during her younger years when she worked. A man called Dylan had been one of her students, and he often visited the elderly woman to make sure that she was okay. And if anything needed fixing around the house, he would happily do it for her. Along with being a bit of a handyman, Dylan also enjoyed going hunting. He would often trek into the nearby forest to find suitable game to hunt, and he would sometimes share the meat from his kills with Doris. One day, Doris decided that the fence around her garden was looking a bit worse for wear, so she asked Dylan to fix it up for her. The kind-hearted man agreed, but told the elderly woman that he also had a surprise for her. Once Dylan arrived at Doris's house, she soon saw what the surprise was. In his arms, the hunter was carrying 4 tiny puppies. He told Doris that he had found them in the forest all on their own and that their mother had been nowhere in sight. Dylan then explained that whilst he would be happy to look after them himself, he already had 2 other dogs at home. That wouldn't be too welcoming to the tiny canines. However, he forgot to mention that the small canines weren't actually dogs but were wolf cubs. After getting over her shock, Doris agreed to take the puppies in herself, as she had been wanting to get a puppy for a while to keep her company. And she could save these 4 lonely babies at the same time. Doris took the pups into her home and immediately found 4 old bowls, which she used to put the animals' food in. The elderly woman emptied a can of meat into each bowl, and the pups were happy to quickly munch it down. But being growing animals and wild ones. Unbeknownst to Doris, the puppies stared at the old woman as if asking for more food. Doris chuckled and joyfully obliged the cubs until they were finally full. Once the young animals were satisfied, Doris laid down some old blankets for them, and the little pups quickly fell fast asleep in their new beds. Once the cubs were asleep, Doris left them in the house and went back outside to thank Dylan for finding the adorable babies. Dylan realized that Doris believed the puppies to be dogs. However, he thought that whilst they were still young, they would not do any harm, and he could find a suitable replacement for when the cubs were strong enough to survive on their own. Later that evening, as Dylan finished up his work on the fence, Doris went and thanked him for his hard work and for always being around to help her out. She then gave the kind-hearted man a bag of sweets for him to take back to his children before bidding him a good night for the evening. Once Dylan had gone, Doris went back inside her home, where she discovered that all 4 cubs were awake and creating quite a bit of a mess. Still overcome with the joy of having some new company, Doris couldn't stay mad at them for long. She cleaned up the mess and then realized that she needed to give each of the puppies a name. She decided to call the 4 cubs Scooby, Spud, Zack, and Spunky. As time went on and the cubs began to grow, Doris began to suspect that they weren't normal dogs. They didn't look like regular canines, as they were much larger. Their teeth were much sharper and they looked more wild all around. In addition, all of the local dogs would growl and bark at Scooby and the rest of the cubs when they walked past. Doris's suspicions were finally confirmed one day when a local hunter was walking past and saw the four canines playing together in her garden. He instinctively reached for his gun but was stopped when Doris asked him what he was doing. The hunter then told the elderly woman that the four animals she had weren't dogs at all but were actually wolves. Doris was shocked by the news, but she wasn't afraid. She loved all of her pups equally, no matter what, and they had never once shown aggression towards her, so she was not worried that they would hurt her. Doris and the four wolves continued to live happily for the next year. The canines were loyal to Doris and guarded the home just like a dog would. As fall came and the temperatures dropped, Doris and the wolves would happily spend their days inside the warm home. One cold fall evening, there was a knock on Doris's door. Wondering who it could be, the elderly woman opened the door, only to be confronted by three strange men. One of the men was holding a gun, which he immediately pointed at Doris. He threatened that if she didn't hand over all of her money and valuables that she had in her home, he would shoot her. The three men barged into Doris's home and began to make their way further in when they suddenly heard four loud growls. It turned out that with all the noise that the men were making, they had woken up the four wolves that had been lying asleep in the living room. The canines realized that Doris was in danger and quickly jumped into action. With the men confused and scared of what was happening, Spunky, Spud, and Zack jumped at them and bit at their legs and ankles. Meanwhile, Scooby ran over to Doris and jumped in front of her, protecting her from the man with the gun. Whilst the wolves fought, the elderly lady snuck into her bedroom, where she called the police. Just as she hung up the phone, a gunshot echoed through the house, followed by a painful animal cry. Doris's heart pounded as she rushed back into the living room, only to find Scooby collapsed on the floor, a bullet wound in his hind leg. One of the intruders had managed to grab the gun and had wounded the loyal animal. Startled by the gunshot, the three men panicked and attempted to flee. However, as they dashed out of the house, they ran straight into a police blockade and were swiftly arrested. Doris, however, paid them no attention. Her only concern was Scooby. Thankfully, she was able to get him the care he needed, and over the next few weeks, his wound healed. Word of the four wolves' heroic actions quickly spread, but to Doris, their newfound fame meant little. She cherished them as if they were any other loyal dogs, and in return, they loved her just as deeply. What an incredible story! If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below. See you in the next video.